Great. All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. As you know, we're going to be talking about black bears and living with bears today. Before, oh, let me make sure. Actually, move my slides. Here we go. Before we get started, just some housekeeping stuff. If you're not familiar with Microsoft Teams, we encourage you to open up the chat, which you can see that icon highlighted there. And then again, you can also turn on your camera if you want to be seen or you don't want to be seen. And then we encourage you to mute yourselves by hitting that mic icon. The chat is going to be really useful if you're not familiar with using it. This is how we want you guys to submit your questions and comments. There will be break periods throughout the workshop where we'll address the comments and questions. But just for practice, if you'd like right now to open your chat and introduce yourself, share your name, your town, and whatever organization you're affiliated with. And then during those breaks, Naya will read out the questions and we'll answer them then. All right, so the agenda for the presentation today, we are going to be learning about black bears. We're going to start with a general overview of bear biology and ecology, just to get us all on the same page. We're then going to talk specifically about living with black bears in Vermont and what it's like, the realities of sharing the landscape with these animals. We're then going to talk about action items we can all take to make a difference living in bear country. And then finally, we'll talk about land use considerations. All right, so up next, section 1 of section 4, getting to know Vermont's black bears. So before we get into the specifics of black bears, I think it's helpful to just discuss the role of the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department when we think about black bear management and conservation in the state. Oh, hold on. Few technical difficulties. Sorry about that. All right, so it's important to understand our mission, which is the conservation of Vermont's fish. Oh man, sorry about that, you guys. Why it's jumping.
That's going to keep happening. In the slideshow tab, use timings is checked, and that's the problem. You may need to stop the PowerPoint, stop the share, and uncheck the use timings button.
Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Did the share end yet?
Yes.
All right, and say that again. I need to go into use timings and the.
So you're in PowerPoint. The tab is slideshow, and that button that says use timings, uncheck that.
Show. Yep, there it is. All right. Let me get us back to the right spot. Okay. And let me share again.
And you're back. You're
all
good.
Right. Take 2, everyone. So the mission of Vermont Fish and Wildlife is the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. This is a really important mission, but it's also a very broad mission. And unfortunately, we don't have the resources to have a detailed conservation program for every one of those species in Vermont. But black bears are a species that we prioritize. And this is because we treat black bears as an umbrella species in Vermont. And what I mean by this is that we know in order for black bears to be successful, they need access to different types of wetland habitats to find the foods that they rely on. They also need access to young forest habitats to find different sets of foods that they rely on. And then they also need access to mature forests to find a whole other suite of foods that they rely on. And of course, we also know that wetlands, young forests, and mature forests are not necessarily all next to each other on the landscape. So they need a connected landscape so that they can safely travel to find these different habitat types and those food sources. And so if we're doing a good job conserving these habitats for bears, it's going to maintain a healthy bear population. But we also know it's going to support all the other species that rely on those habitats as well. So the Fish and Wildlife Department's, bear program is really broken into 4 general prongs. Really, the backbone of the work we do for bears in Vermont is through habitat conservation and habitat management. And that can run the gamut from actively being involved in purchasing lands and putting them into conservation. We're also involved in like Act 250 review process for potential development projects that may negatively impact black bear habitat. And then we also work with private landowners to offer technical advice when they consider how to manage their woodlots. We occasionally conduct research to better understand Vermont's black bears, and traditionally, most of our research projects have been oriented around trying to better understand black bear habitat needs and how different large-scale human development projects may impact black bear habitat use. Probably what we're most known for is overseeing the state's black bear hunting season. So we set the regulations around bear hunting in the state, but then also we are collecting important biological data from every bear that's harvested in the state. And it's actually that information that really helps us build our estimates of the bear population and monitor the trend of our bear population over time. And then relevant for today's discussion, we also put a lot of resources into mitigating conflicts between people and bears. And our efforts there are really focused on trying to help people figure out solutions to resolve ongoing conflicts with bears, but ideally to help people understand the steps they need to take to proactively prevent future conflicts with bears. But before we can think about how to promote better coexistence with black bears, we really need to understand these animals. So right now we're going to talk a little bit about the basic bear biology and ecology as it relates to how we share the landscape with these animals. So it's important to understand that black bears are a relatively long-lived species. And in fact, the oldest bear on record in Vermont was 39 years old. So they can live for multiple decades. They're also a relatively intelligent animal. And what I mean by this is that bears have been shown to be good problem solvers, and they also have been shown to have long memories. And so they're able to learn from their life experiences and change their behaviors based on learned life experiences. A bear's sense of smell is its most powerful sense. And this can honestly make it sometimes hard for people to relate to bears. We are typically, most of us, a much more visually oriented animal, and we're perceiving the world around us through our eyes, where bears are really perceiving the world around them through their noses. And then bears are a opportunistic omnivore. And this means that they just have a very diverse diet, but it's also a very flexible diet, and they're always willing to try a new food source. And when here in Vermont, we think about what are the common foods that make up a bear's diet. Really, the bulk of their diet comes from plants. They're eating vegetation directly. But again, they're not an herbivore, so they have a simple chambered stomach. So they struggle to effectively digest vegetation. So they're really focused on eating plants during that growth stage of the plant when it is most digestible for them. But really, their bread and butter are the fruits produced by plants. And we refer to those fruits as mast, M-A-S-T. And we can put mast into 2 categories. There's soft mast, which are those soft, fleshy fruits. So things like our blackberries, blueberries, raspberries, wild cherries, apples. And then there's hard mast. Those are those fruits that are protected by a hard shell. So the common ones in Vermont are acorns, beech nuts, and then in certain parts of the state, hickory and hazelnuts are also important foods for them. And then beyond plants, they do eat a lot of other things. So bears will eat lots of insects. They will opportunistically predate on deer fawns, moose calves, bird eggs, nestling birds. They will scavenge carcasses as well. And so when we think about all of those foods, there really is a seasonal component to when they are available to bears. So certain seasons, some of those foods are really available, but during other seasons, they are not. And so bears are really navigating the landscape, looking for the conditions that support those plants that produce the foods they rely on. But also they're relying on those habitats during the seasons when those plants are either growing or producing those ripe masts. And so as I talked about earlier, the really kind of broad key habitat features bears are keying in on are different types of wetland habitats, those young forest habitat conditions, and those mature forests. And we'll take a minute to spend a little more time talking about the importance of hard mast for bears. So again, primarily beech nuts and acorns. And those are a really critical food source for bears because those nuts ripen during the fall, which is a time of year when bears are in this physiological state that we call hyperphagia, which is just a fancy science word for meaning they become eating machines. And they are spending the majority of their time trying to consume as many calories as possible before they hibernate for the winter when foods are not available. And beech nuts are a really critical food source for bears here in Vermont. Um, Research has shown throughout the region that where beech nuts and acorns are available to bears, bears will actually select for those beech nuts over acorns. And this is because beech nuts have a higher caloric value than acorns. And then also, if any of you have ever tried eating a red oak acorn versus a beech nut, it's pretty quick to see beech nuts taste a lot better than acorns do. And so we'll see on these beech trees, they have really thin bark, and bears will climb certain trees to feed on the nuts directly from the branches before they fall. Of course, they also spend a lot of time foraging for the nuts on the ground after they've fallen as well. But that process of climbing up and down these beech trees creates these bear claw scar marks on the trees that can help us identify important feeding sites for bears. Interestingly, beech nuts or beech trees don't typically produce nuts every year. They tend to produce big flushes of nuts every other year or every 3 years. Adult female black bears also don't produce cubs every year. Their cubs typically stay with them for about a year and a half. And so that means adult female bears are typically giving birth to cubs every other year. And research out of Maine actually found that with one of their populations of bears where beech nuts were an important food source for them, those female bears in that population over time synchronized their reproduction with the beech nut cycles. So they were giving birth to cubs in those winters following a good beech nut crop. And so I'm going to show a couple examples of what this habitat use and seeking out of food sources looks like on the ground from the perspective of an individual bear. So here you can see that picture of that bear at the bottom of the screen. She's wearing a GPS collar. She's got yellow ear tags. This was an adult female bear that we had part of a long-term study we were doing a number of years ago in southern Vermont around the towns of Searsburg and Reedsboro. Those yellow circles on the map represent locations, her locations collected by that GPS collar. And those locations were collected from 2014 through 2018. And so you can see this big cluster of those yellow dots, her locations, kind of represent what we considered her core home range. And it was about 4 by 4 miles, or so around 4 square miles. And then the other thing you can see on this map are those kind of black shaded polygons, and those represent concentrations of those bear scarred beech trees. So this important food source for bears living in this area. And so this map here again is showing all of the locations we collected from this bear in her core home range area. And again, just representing how she's moving through across the landscape in her home range seasonally, seeking out like clusters and concentrations of food sources that were available to her. But if we just zoom in on her locations during one fall in the year of 2015, when we had a good beech nut crop in that study area, we see all of her locations shrink down into this one of those bear scarred beech concentrations. And so you can see how the majority of her time from October 1st through November 15th, she was in those beech stands foraging on beech nuts. Now, if we look at that same bear, the previous fall in 2014, we had a really poor beech nut crop in 2014. So now we're zoomed way out so we can see that core home range of hers at the top center of this map. And that fall, when beech nuts were not available, we saw her make these relatively straight line movements south into northwestern Massachusetts, where the forest transitioned from more beech-dominated forests to more oak-dominated forests. And she spent that fall down in northwestern Massachusetts foraging for acorns in the oak stands down there. And then by, again, mid-ish November, she turned around and came right back up to her core home range to den for the winter. And so this is just a nice example, showing the relationship between how bears take advantage of beech nuts versus acorns from year to year, but just also how important concentrations of high quality foods are for bears, and their willingness to travel to find those foods. All right, and with that, hand it over to Naya to read out some of the questions, if there are any yet.
Hi, I'm Naya. I'm a conservation planning specialist, and I'm going to read out. We have a question from Denise Eddy. How will this year's drought conditions affect food supplies as we move into winter?
Good question. It certainly had an impact on some of the late summer berry crops for bears, for sure, because a lot of plants are really sensitive to droughts, late frost, too much rain. All these different conditions can really wreak havoc on annual growth and mass production for plants. Right now, though, fortunately, the hard mast food, so the acorns and beech nuts, trees tend to be a little more resilient to short-term droughts or times of too much water. Just because, again, they're so big and they have so many resources available to them. So what we're seeing right now is we're actually actively out conducting acorn and beech nut surveys across Vermont right now. And so far, it's looking like most places we're surveying, acorn production is looking pretty good this year. And we're just next week going to start surveying the beech nuts. So again, I think for the most part, our oak trees and our beech trees, they set their flowers earlier in the season, and they seem to be able to tolerate this drought. Again, as long as it stays short term from a tree perspective, it shouldn't cause too much issue, or it's not causing much issue this year. Time will tell for next year. Oh, you're muted, Naya.
Thanks. I have a question from David Maroney. Given the straight line movement, it's likely that F30 already knew the location of the Massachusetts. Is it likely that F30 already knew the location of the Massachusetts oak stand? Or is it more likely that she went looking for a suitable area to feed and found it by chance? At what life stage do bears explore the most for new food sources to form their long-term memory?
Such a great question, and it is still somewhat of a mystery to us. But our best educated guesses are it's probably a mix of things. One idea, right, is that maybe she traveled there with her mother when she was a cub, and learned through that way. Another way is that when we have some of these individuals collared for a long span of time, sometimes we see them make these seemingly weird long distance movements, and they're kind of short-term movements, and then they come back. And so we've often wondered, maybe these are just like exploratory trips where they're trying to like find like the greater landscape or understand the greater landscape beyond their home range. But then we also really wonder if their sense of smell is playing a role in this too. And again, it's like I said before, it's really hard for us to fully appreciate what they're keying into via their sense of smell because our sense of smell is so bad in comparison. Um, so whether or not they're able to smell the nuts across the landscape, but then the other thing that's going on is bears do a ton of scent marking and communicating with each other through scent marking by rubbing and biting trees, but also by leaving scats or their poop. And so we also sometimes wonder if somehow there's either intentional or just inadvertent communication going on between bears. And bears have these overlapping home ranges. And so they may be learning from their neighbors as well. So those are kind of the working theories that are out there.
Great. I'll just remind everyone to put your questions in the chat rather than the tab that says Q&A. I do have another question from Linda. What about the impact of beech leaf disease? Southern Vermont beech trees are in terrible shape.
Yes, that is a true concern. Our beech trees have been battling with beech bark disease for decades now, but seem to at least be holding their own and still producing adequate nuts to support wildlife. But beech leaf disease is moving like wildfire. I'm based in Southern Vermont, so I see it firsthand. Um, we are genuinely concerned about the long-term viability of beech in the state. It's pretty depressing, but the silver lining to it all is, again, these are really resilient animals. Black bears have a huge range when you think species wide. So we've got black bears living in this country or in North America, lots of them who do not have beech trees, on the landscape where they live. So we know that we've got a lot of acorns or oak. With climate change, conditions may continue to improve for oak trees in Vermont. Hickory is another important hardmass species that may also increase its distribution with climate change. And so we're anticipating that, yeah, bears, especially our mountain bears and bears up in the Northeast Kingdom, are going to, over time, have to transition to alternative food sources. But again, time will tell. We're still early in the process of beech leaf disease being on the landscape.
Great. Another question, David Maroney. Without beech, is it likely that Vermont would be able to support the same density of bears across the landscape?
We aren't sure, but it is something we're thinking about, and it seems like certain parts of the state in the short term, as if we start losing beech trees, yeah, we may not be able to support the same densities we're supporting right now. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we're gonna move on. I know there's one other question, but we can try to address it at the next break. And in the meantime, please type your questions into the chat.
All right, so now on to section 2, living with black bears, the realities, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I'm going to start this section off with a lot of figures, and then we'll get into some more kind of take-home messages for all of you. But I really want you to all be oriented to the problem and maybe the things that are underlyingly influencing this issue. So this first figure I'm showing are the annual reports of human bear incidents that we receive from the public, going back from 2002 up until last year, 2024. And so there's a few trends that are important to focus on with this figure. Oh, and I'll just say that these these reports generally represent people dealing with bears in more human-dominated spaces. It's not, there are some just straight up sightings of bears, kind of typically in unexpected places, but most of it involves some level of interaction between the person and bear. So from 2002 through 2011, we were seeing this relatively steady number of reports from year to year. And then starting in 2012, we start seeing this like big jumps in reports every few years. And then that really started jumping bigger in 2018. And then 2020, we saw this huge increase, which we hoped was just a COVID effect. But unfortunately, it has sustained itself beyond the initial year of the pandemic. So we know with these big increases, like one important factor I should point out is that in 2018, our department did make some concerted efforts to make it easier for the public to submit reports to us. So, people can reach us by phone calls or by email. But in 2018, we actually launched a web-based reporting form. And since then, we've really been promoting that reporting form and encouraging people to use that to reach out to us. So we know a little bit of this is what we call reporting rate. We've increased people's ability and knowledge about reporting incidents to us, but we also know that that's not solely what's driving these drastic increases we've seen over time. And then the other pattern that's I've highlighted with the gray and black shading is this alternating increase in reports, where we're seeing in even numbered years higher numbers of reports compared to the odd numbered years before and after. And so an interesting factor to think about with this alternating pattern we're seeing is that this actually tracks with the state's beech nut crops. So since 2011, we have been seeing kind of consistent odd numbered years having good beech nut crops, and then the even numbered years having poor beech nut crops. Again, this is not directly driving this alternating pattern because beech nuts are available on the landscape in the fall, but the bulk of these reports are coming to us in the spring and summer. And the summer is really when the bulk of them come in. So we know there's some sort of like indirect relationship going on here that beech nut availability might be driving. And we wonder if it might be a population level effect. Again, maybe our population has synchronized reproduction with the beech nut cycles. And therefore, in even numbered years, we're just seeing more females with dependent cubs on the landscape, and also more naive 2-year-old bears on the landscape that are causing increases or jumps in reports. But all right, so that's kind of where things are at. And I will say these big increases have caused a lot of strain. It has pressed our ability to adequately offer assistance to all of the Vermonters dealing with issues with bears. And I would say that there's definitely certain communities and residents within the state who are, feeling pretty wary after dealing consistently with bears year after year after year. So what has been driving these increases of human bear incidents in Vermont? Most people's minds immediately goes to, well, it must be the size of our population. And so this figure is showing you our annual estimates of Vermont's black bear population. Those black dots represent the average estimate for the population each year. And then the lines or bars coming off of those dots represent the confidence intervals. So basically the amount of uncertainty that dot is at the right location. And so if you kind of look at this trend over time, you can see we've got this increasing trend in our bear population. But if you look at the more recent years, the past 4 years are circled with that red circle at the end, and you can see our bear population over the past 4 years is higher than than where we've had it in the recent past. And so right now we are sharing the landscape with more bears than we're used to. But if you look at the preceding 3 years circled in green there, that's 2018 through 2020, the bear population at that time was really right where it has been for the last couple decades. And so that's when we really started seeing this increase in reported conflicts between people and bears. So it can't just be a larger than usual population that is driving these increases in conflicts between people and bears. But again, we know it's part of the mix, right? Obviously, the more bears on the landscape, the more people on the landscape, the more opportunities for them to interact. So what are some other factors to think about, though, is not just the size of our bear population, but it's also the distribution of our bear population. And so the first map on this slide, titled Black Bear Habitat in Vermont, 1989, this represents where the majority of our bear population was distributed in Vermont by the end of the 1980s. The green shaded areas, which follow the spine of the Green Mountains and then up into the Northeast Kingdom, that was really our core bear range in Vermont. But by the end of the 1980s, we were starting to see bears expand outside of those areas into those blue and pink shaded areas in the state. But you can also see we had large swaths of Vermont where we did not have significant bears living at that time. Then you look at the more orange scaled map, the reported bear conflicts in Vermont from 2011 through 2022. And you can see we're receiving reports of human bear incidents kind of across all of Vermont at this point. And so through that population growth that I showed you with the previous figure, that also meant our population expanded its distribution in the state. And so we now have resident black bears living basically in every town in Vermont, excluding the communities on the islands and Lake Champlain. And so we just have more people living in bear country at this point. And again, more opportunities for bears and people to interact. Another component that we know contributes significantly to human-bear conflicts is natural food availability for bears. And we kind of alluded to this earlier. Research has shown time and time again that when natural foods are limited, are scarce, whether it's because of droughts or frost or just natural variation in a plant's mass production, bears are more likely to try to seek out an alternative food source. We also know that bears are all individuals, and so some bears are more curious than others to discover new foods, and some are more bold than others to try kind of high-risk food sources. Whatever the driving factor that might kind of force a bear to seek out food alternatives and discover things like bird feeders, garbage, compost, backyard chickens. Once they find those food sources and they get that positive food reward, that creates the potential for them to continue seeking out that food source. And over time, that can create a behavioral condition that we call food conditioned, meaning that bear has now made foraging for human-caused foods a regular part of its behavior. And it's irrelevant how available wild foods are. They are still going to search those backyards for food sources, even when other foods are abundant. And then the more time they spend foraging for these human food sources close to people, and the more interactions they have with us, our barking dogs, our cars, that can reduce their wariness around people and create this other behavioral change that we call habituation. And it just makes them much more confident to forage close to people. And again, I think really the key message to remember here is that every meal is a learning experience for a bear. And then another major contributing factor to why we're seeing an increase in human bear conflicts in Vermont is that we have a lot of human-caused foods available to these animals, and we are creating a lot of learning opportunities for Vermont's bears. So this pie chart shows from all those reports we receive from Vermonters, we track pieces of information from those reports. And the big one we're tracking is what human foods were involved in each of those incidents that we hear about. And when we look at those numbers, we see that garbage is involved in 46% of the reports we received from 2011 through 2023. We also see that bird feeders make up 15% of the reports, chickens make up 14%, and compost makes up 10%. These are like big contributing factors to why bears are spending time close to people and causing property damage. And for a lot of Vermonters, a bear tipping over their garbage can once or twice a week is annoying, but it's not the end of the world. For other Vermonters, bear ripping down their bird feeder, it's just part of living in bear country. And so for a lot of people, they don't see this as a problem initially. But the reality is that for certain bears, we see them change their behavior and escalate their behavior to a point where they are causing serious property damage for some people. They are, in some cases, creating real safety risks. In rare cases, we are dealing with Vermonters who are getting injured in these interactions with bears. But more often, we're putting these bears at risk, and we are having to euthanize bears to protect public safety and to protect property. But the reality is if 5 steps earlier, we could have made changes sooner and not allow these bears to access these food sources, we never would have gotten ourselves into these situations. So what can we do? Well, we can continue to protect habitat for bears so that they have adequate natural food options available to them. We can try to manage the number of bears in the state. Hunting is our best way to do that. But really, hunting is designed to be sustainable. It's not designed to drive a population so low that we don't have to deal with the individual animals anymore. We can also try to manage bear behavior by creating negative experiences for bears every time they try to get human foods. But the problem with that is that if they can still get that positive food reward, it's really unrealistic that we can create enough of a negative experience that outweighs that positive food reward. So really where we're focusing all of our effort is trying to get people to change their behaviors to more proactively secure and remove these human food sources that are drawing bears into these situations in the first place. So Fish and Wildlife is doing this by a lot of outreach and education. I mentioned before that web-based reporting form. We're encouraging people to report situations to us because we're using those as an outreach opportunity. Every person that submits a report to us gets either an email, phone call, or site visit from one of our staff, one of our game wardens, or we're also in partnership with USDA Wildlife Services. And so we're trying to offer as much technical advice as we can to those people who are being directly impacted. But again, the goal of all of this is proactive, and we really need more Vermont citizens, more individuals, and more communities to also help us promote these messages to see effective change. And so those messages, thinking back to that pie chart and what are the major human food sources drawing bears in and contributing to human bear incidents in Vermont, we're designing information and messages related to each of those. And so bird feeders aren't the #1 food source that gets reported to us, but we know it's a major problem. We look at bird feeders as the gateway drug for bears to get into human bear conflicts. And this is because you think about what we put in our bird feeders. They are seeds produced by plants. It is a type of hard mast. This is a food source these animals have evolved to forage for. But now instead of having to search through the leaf litter on the forest floor or climb a tree, they can just grab a tube, crack it open, and suck down thousands of nuts in one sitting. And again, remember, every meal is a learning opportunity. So you look at, especially these females with cubs, They are learning what is food, where is food, how to get food. And we have a lot of people who are resistant to giving up feeding birds and try to get creative to make their bird feeders bear-proof. And we caution people that, again, these are really creative, determined animals that are going to work hard to try to exploit that food source. And even if you are successful in finding a way to make your bird feeder bear-proof, remember, it's the smell of the bird seed that is drawing that bear in. And once they're in your backyard, if they can't get your bird feeder, they're going to start looking around for what other food sources you might have. Do you have garbage? Do you have backyard chickens? Do you have backyard composting? And then the other point I'll make is that a lot of people say, well, I take my bird feeder in at night. Notice every picture I have shown you so far was taken during the day. Bears are not nocturnal. They can be active whenever they want to. So really the best solution with bird feeders is to not feed birds when bears are active. So that means only feeding birds during the winter months. We really encourage people to go to Audubon's Native Plants for Birds program. It's a really great resource where you can put in your zip code and you can get a whole list of native plants and what birds they attract and support. And so we're really trying to encourage people to think about gardening and landscaping to attract birds instead of putting out bird feeders. All right, a harder attractant to deal with is garbage. Generating garbage is not a choice. We all do it. And it can be a real challenge to keep bears out of our garbage. So really, there's kind of two key things to think about when you're thinking about keeping bears out of garbage. It's secure storage and odor control. Secure storage is the key. Again, bears' noses are so strong, we're never gonna fool them into not smelling the garbage is there. We can minimize the odors, but really we need to focus on that secure storage. So storing your garbage in a secure building, whether that be a basement, a locked garage, a really sturdy shed. In an ideal world, investing in manufactured bear-resistant garbage containers. And then when you're thinking about the odor control, disposing of your garbage as frequently as possible. You know, freezing smelly food scraps is something we used to recommend before the composting law, but there's still certain things we shouldn't be putting in our compost. So that can still be an effective solution. And then, soaking a rag or a sponge with ammonia and keeping that in like the door jamb or windowsill or lid of your garbage container or the structure where you store your garbage can be a deterrent, but again, it's not a foolproof solution. And there's a handful of studies that have started looking at, well, what happens if we can get an entire neighborhood or an entire community to securely store their garbage? And what these studies are finding is that it can have a significant reduction in the number of conflicts between people and bears. And one town out in Colorado found that when they got 60% of their residents to use bear-resistant garbage storage containers, they saw a huge drop in their conflicts between people and bears. So we know this is the right direction, but it's not an easy one because we've been recommending this to Vermonters for so many years now. But right now we're still dealing with an inventory issue where it's really hard to find these products at Vermont hardware stores or not hardly any of the Vermont waste haulers are offering these products at this time. So we're still trying to kind of generate understanding, knowledge, and then hopefully demand for these products in Vermont. Composting in bear country, again, it's secure storage and odor control, but now we're flipping it. Odor control is the key thing to think about. And if you are doing backyard composting, you need to make sure you're using the recommended recipe of 3 parts brown materials to every 1 part green materials going into your compost. And that's going to help the food scraps break down faster, and it's going to minimize the odors that compost pile is giving off. No meat and dairy in your compost, please. And ideally get a tumbler so that it's in some sort of secure container. It's not going to be bear proof. It might not even barely be bear resistant, but it is just one more barrier to help prevent bears from easily accessing it, and it makes it a lot easier to regularly turn it, which is an important part to help it break down quickly. Chickens, bees can be a big problem. I'm not going to go into the details on electric fencing because there's a lot of resources on our website and another website I'll talk about in a minute. But the key thing to know is that you really should have an electric fence if you're going to have backyard chickens or bees. And you need to have it set properly to deter a bear. And you've got to learn how to use that fence and set it properly. But once you do that, an electric fence is so effective at keeping bears out of chickens and bees. And it can also be a great solution for composting garbage if you don't have access to other materials. And then some other things to think about, don't store food in vehicles, keep your vehicle windows up, doors locked, clean your grill after every use, don't feed your pets outside, don't store your winter's bird seed outside in a garbage can like you can see in this picture here. And yeah, store any animal feeds that you have in a secure location, ideally indoors. And then if you do have a bear coming into your backyard, we tell people to scare that bear, make that bear feel uncomfortable in human spaces. So if you see a bear nosing around your chicken coop or looking in your windows, it's tempting to just take a picture, but make some noise, make your presence known, and try to create an uncomfortable experience for that bear. All right, and with that, we'll take more questions.
So I think we don't have any new questions that haven't been answered. So I think we may just keep moving along when you're ready, Jackie.
Perfect. All right. For the last section, making a difference in bear country. This is where I really want to think about, all right, now we know the basic steps people should be taking, but how can we work maybe as a community or as a group to kind of help get everyone on board? And I'll say before we get into the details here, I've been talking about, resources through Vermont Fish and Wildlife, but BearWise is another really great resource for basic information about how to coexist with bears. But a great thing about BearWise is that they also have a lot of resources and materials to help better educate people and community members about the importance and how to secure attractants against bears. And Vermont is a BearWise member. And so, yeah, again, I think we just shared the link. I really highly recommend you look into some of their resources. But they do have a whole section where thinking about action plans for communities in bear country. And there's kind of some key general steps to think about if you want to think about, all right, what can we do in my town to help improve coexistence with black bears? First step is just investigate. So figure out and identify what are the problems, who are the potentially interested partners that you can work with in your community, and also think about what are the major ways that people are sharing information in your community so that you can kind of integrate your messages into those conversations. And then once you kind of have a sense of what the problem is, where the problem is, who the players are, and how to share information, you can then think about getting organized and motivating community members to take the necessary steps to promote coexistence. So build a team, talk to potentially select board members, members of the Conservation Commission, the local police department. If your community has homeowner associations, or other non-governmental organizations who are engaged in wildlife or natural resources type efforts. And then again, people love bears. So you can probably also just enlist engaged, active citizens who maybe aren't members of a specific group. Once you've got these folks, you've built a team, you've gotten organized, and you're getting kind of partnership and buy-in from your team, you can think about, well, how are we going to take action? And there's kind of two general ways that you can break down, I think, effective action items. The big one is just education. So sharing those BearWise steps, so like the not feeding birds during the spring, summer, and fall, how to secure garbage, the importance of electric fences with backyard chickens, sharing those steps with people, but then also sharing the resources that are available to people. So pointing people towards maybe like the Bearwise website, or pointing people towards the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Living with Bears reporting form, so that those people can get connected with the professionals who can offer them guidance and assistance specific to their situation. Because the reality is some of these incidents happening with people are very easy to solve, but others are very complicated and do take a lot of hand-holding and coordination. And that's where we're happy to step in and kind of assist with those situations. And then another take action option is to think about implementing some kind of systematic changes to help support removing and securing attractants in your community. So thinking about ways that maybe your community can improve the availability of bear secure materials like electric fences, bear resistant garbage containers or dumpsters, or containers for businesses or residents to temporarily store food scraps in. Bearwise suggests that useful ones to think about is if your town or homeowners associations have larger contracts with waste haulers, thinking about how to develop Bearwise garbage contracts with those waste haulers that kind of set some standards for bear resistant containers. Or even thinking about, is it a good step for your town to maybe consider enacting a wildlife ordinance, a municipal ordinance to kind of require some of these Bearwise actions through residents, businesses, visitors in your town. And I'll give an example of one group in Vermont, and I see at least one member of the Mad River Valley Bear Initiative here in this group. So here is a group. This is a grassroots initiative in Vermont. Their team includes representatives from 8 local groups. They've got 3 conservation commissions represented, 1 recreation commission represented, 3 local NGOs. Sugar Bush, one of the major businesses in the region, is involved. They meet once a month at these meetings. They have an agenda that they cover. They have action items. And their real goal is promoting education and outreach that encourages the residents and visitors in the Mad River Valley to understand the action items needed and to actually take those action items to promote coexistence with bears. So to achieve that education goal of theirs, they host a website. They host speakers to invite speakers to come in to the Mad River Valley to speak about bears and living with bears. And then they also table at different community events where they in person are promoting coexistence with bears. So they're really making their presence known and trying to get the information out in their community through a variety of ways. They're also engaging the community by hosting this really fun contest that they call the Great Amazing Bear Story Contest. And each year they ask community members to submit their best bear story from the year. And then the winners of that contest are given prizes. And I know at least at one time the prize was a bear resistant garbage can. They also produce an annual summary of their work so the community can see, the efforts that they've taken over the year. And then they assist the community they've worked with a couple local hardware stores to get them to carry bear resistant garbage containers. And they've also created this really great toolkit for homeowners and visitors. So the Mad River Valley, right, has a lot of tourism is happening in that area. And so they've created these kits for like short-term property rental owners to leave them in their units for the visitors to see. And those kits, they assembled through materials available through Bearwise. So there's just one example of how one community is handling it, but there's really so many different ways that this could be addressed at the community level. And then this is my last slide. I like to share this quote because I think it's really relevant This is a quote from the environmental reporter David Barron in his book, The Beast in the Garden, which is a great read if you've never read it. But he states, people must accept that they are participants in the natural world, not mere observers. And I think that to me really resonates with the bear issue and coexisting with wildlife.